All right, here are your notes on Britain during the age of liberalism. This is Victorian England. All right, one quick recommendation for while you watch this video, since you will have to fill out a Google form about it and you will need to remember this stuff. Turn off the phone, turn off the TV. Don't check Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or anything else. Pay attention to the video. It's only 15 minutes. All right, we're starting with talking about the Great Exposition of 1851 London. This was organized by Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. It's held at a building called the Crystal Palace, which was a monument to basically the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. All right, you see this drawing of it right here. Took tons of steel, iron, glass. It was basically a World's Fair. This was supposed to showcase British progress to the rest of the world. All right, Queen Victoria herself was a very interesting woman. She was Queen of England for 64 years. She became queen at 18. She was eventually married to her first cousin. That marriage was set up by her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, Leopold the first king of Belgium, and she's also the first known carrier of what was called the royal disease or hemophilia. When we get to the Romanovs, we'll talk about how that family was infected with hemophilia, and a lot of European royalty was all going back to her. She had 9 children and many grandchildren, great grandchildren who married into royalty across Europe, and that's why she ended up being the grandmother of 3 combatants, 2 of whom were fighting against the other one in World War One. I've got here that she personified respectability, and what did that mean? All right, in Victorian England, people started to develop a new sense of morality. People started to look down on things like public drunkenness, lewd conduct, things like that. Victoria actually proposed to her husband rather than the other way around, which that's the way it would have to be since she was a queen. And when she became monarch, there was a question in Europe as to, or in England, as to whether or not the British monarchy would stay the monarchy as it was. This was the time period of all the revolutions we talked about on the continent. But then she eventually ended up being the monarch who probably lost some of the most control of the monarchy's power and had a bunch of constitutional limits placed on her power. All right, during this time in England, we have a Victorian consensus that encompassed the capitalist ethic, where you work hard and prosper, self-reliance, faith in progress, and belief in competition and that the fittest survive in competition. All right, and this competition belief comes in part from Charles Darwin, his writings on the origin of species, which you've heard about Darwin from your science classes, and his theory of evolution, that the fittest survive in society. And there was a question among politicians as to should the state intervene in people's lives or should they step back and just let everyone compete on what they call life's playing field. Now, the acceptance in some areas of Darwin's beliefs was bad news for the Church of England. But the Church of England was struggling at this time. Most people in England assumed that everyone went to church. But I've got here in front of me the figure that at the time, while most British people believed that everyone else went to church, only about 7.2 million out of 18 million people in Great Britain went to church. And that if everyone had wanted to go to church, there were only enough churches in the kingdom to accommodate about 58% of the population. So they weren't quite as religious as they claimed to be. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was eventually applied by Herbert Spencer to the business world, and this was used to describe the success of a lot of like the American robber barons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, guys like that. This became known as social Darwinism. All right, so I've mentioned that Darwin's publishing led to a little attack on the church. Like I said, less than half of British subjects attended church. And the Anglican Church started to lose influence. Eventually, Parliament allowed non-Anglicans to attend Oxford and Cambridge, which had been banned for a long time. And a lot of Britons, while they may not have been churchgoers, were still concerned about lower class conduct. So a lot of reform organizations actually gave monetary assistance to English who stayed what they call morally pure. Around this time, we also have the Crimean War. This is when Russia and the Ottoman Empire went to war. And Russia was seeking to gain access to the Straits of Constantinople. They also claimed to be the protectors of the Orthodox Christians that were living in the Ottoman Empire. So Russia occupies the Nubian principalities and the Turks declare war. Now, we talked about during the late Renaissance era how Europeans were scared to death of the Turkish or Muslim influence to the east. Well, at this time, most of Europe went to war against Russia, aiding the Turks. The British, the French, the Austrians, the Piedmont army from Cavour, who wanted to gain Austria's, ingratiate himself to some of those other powers later, they all went to war against Russia. The really turning point of that war was the siege of Sebastopol on the peninsula of Crimea and on the edge of the Black Sea. And with this map, you can see Sebastopol is right here. Now, the Charge of the Light Brigade, poem you may have heard by Alfred Lord Tennyson, that's dealing with the Battle of Balaclava right there. But Sebastopol really showed the incompetence of the British Army. It showed that there were a lot of people who really were in positions of power who shouldn't have been. I've got here that there were a lot of deaths from disease during this war. This is when Florence Nightingale became a household name. Florence Nightingale, was a nurse, and she actually helped the profession gain some respectability because up until this time, nurses were really looked down upon. If you look at this painting from the Crimean War, that could almost be taken from the American Civil War, which just started 6 years after the Crimean War. So, same methods of fighting. The Charge of the Light Brigade, immortalized the, they were called the Light Brigade, and who, through miscommunication of orders, attempted to charge at the wrong artillery battery, suffered extreme casualties. It's one of the most famous poems in history, quoted even as Saving Private Ryan, where the corporal says, "Ours is not to reason why, ours is but to do and die." And it's a monument to the supposed bravery of the Light Brigade, but also the ineptness of some of the British commanders. All right. Unfortunately, my computer is freezing right now. Come on, computer. All right, so the end of the Crimean War really ended up leaving Victorian Britain as Europe's strongest power, and that's concluded with the Treaty of Paris, or Peace of Paris. But again, you will need to recognize Florence Nightingale's name, and she did point out to the British government things that need to be fixed in the care of soldiers. All right, when we talk about Victorian politics, I said that England had, for the most part, violent revolutions on the continent in the 1840s, 1830s and 1840s, and part of that come on. All right, William Gladstone is a religious man that is doing everything he can to support laissez-faire policies in the British government. He also British colonization of new areas, which a lot of Britons were very heavily disagree with this because they were proud of their empire, but he thought colonization was just too expensive. Now, his main opponent in British government was a guy named Benjamin Disraeli. All right, Benjamin Disraeli became leader of the Conservatives, and he was a Jewish man by birth who was baptized into the Anglican Church. He got along really well with the Queen, while Gladstone did not. Excuse me. On his deathbed, the Queen asked to see Disraeli, and Disraeli actually said no because he was afraid that she would just ask him to take a message to Prince Albert. Disraeli did push for a new reform bill, even though he was a conservative. He wanted to beat the liberals to the punch. The Reform Bill of 1867 changed the representation some in the House of Commons. It extended the right to vote to urban workers, but there's still not universal male suffrage in England at that time. That didn't come until like 1918. All right, so I've got there that more voters were enfranchised or given the right to vote. The House of Commons, they received a little bit more authority. And another reform bill in 1884 adds 2 million more voters. That's pushed forward by Gladstone. And I've got that enfranchised a lot of agricultural laborers. So now basically everybody that's a man that could vote in England, except for sons who are sons expect you to study these, but I'm just going to go through some of these very quickly these next few slides because I've only got about in. In 1870, Gladstone pushed for competitive civil service exams to prove that you actually had intelligent people working in the government bureaucracy. They started to push to an end to the purchase of army commissions. The Factory Act started to regulate working conditions. The Public Health Act started to expand the role of the state urban sanitation. You may remember this with William Hogarth and his paintings. This was also pushed for by Edwin Chadwick. You might remember as being one of the health reformers that was the author of one of the documents in the Manchester DBQ we recently did. Disraeli, for his part, really made the conservative platform focus on nationalism and imperialism. He wanted to make sure that the landed gentlemen, or basically the old nobility, dominated. They did dominate the House of Commons until the late 1880s, the Cabinet until 1893, and the House of Lords until well into the 20th century. The big issue in the late 1800s, late 19th century in England, though, was going to be Irish Home Rule. Since the Act of Union in 1801, Ireland had been united with Great Britain. They were governed by the British Parliament. Irish Catholics started to press for Home Rule. That does not mean Irish independence. It just means a separate Irish Parliament where they can make decisions for themselves. They would still be part of the British Kingdom, part of the United Kingdom. 1886, Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, sponsored a Home Rule bill but was defeated. He had introduced a second one in 1893. That was also defeated. And one of the leaders in this push for Irish Home Rule is a guy named Charles Stewart Parnell. He actually ended up falling victim to some political scandal, though, in that he was accused and found guilty of having an affair with another Irish leader. And you think about it nowadays, that happens among politicians all the time. It usually isn't devastating to their career. I mean, it certainly wasn't to Bill Clinton. And at that time, it's enough to, for the most part, end Charles Parnell's political career. The Liberals did succeed in pushing a Home Rule bill through Parliament in 1914, but it was difficult to enforce because of a lot of opposition among Protestants in Ulster, which was the northern counties in Ireland. This gives us a start of things like the Irish Republican Army, and why we eventually have a split between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Around this time, there was also increased unionization in Great Britain. I've got there that unions became more aggressive in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. The Prime Minister at the time, Arthur Balfour, believed that voters wanted free trade policies. So there were several government decisions that would weaken unions. For instance, right here, the Taft Vale decision, it said that unions were responsible for any money that business owners lost during union strikes. So they would have to basically compensate the owners if they go on strike. Then a court ruling known as the Osborne decision was when a railway worker sued because he didn't want his union funds being used to support labor candidates. So these things are all leading towards the weakening of labor unions. All right, there's a new Liberal Prime Minister named Herbert Asquith you need to recognize that became Prime Minister in 1908. And I've got here that with the passage of the Parliament Act of 1911, Asquith actually had threatened to ask King George to create new peerages. That means basically new members of the House of Lords. It's because the House of Lords refused to pass a budget that came from Chancellor of the Exchequer David Lloyd George, whose name we'll see again in World War I. All right, at that time, the House of Lords did have the power to veto a budget. Well, in order to get around this, Asquith threatens with the House of Lords by saying King George would just create new peerages, and the House of Lords caved. And with this new Parliament Act, it provided the House of Lords, they cannot prevent the adoption of legislation if the House of Commons passes it 3 times in a period of less than 2 years. Essentially, kind of like in the United States, how Congress can override a presidential veto. It's a huge step towards political democracy in England. Weakens the power of those noblemen who had made up the House of Lords, or traditional aristocracy. And then a few other reforms come along with 1911, a liberal bill that provided payment of salaries to members of the House of Commons, which remember would allow not only rich people to serve. There's a National Insurance Act and minimum wage law passed in 1911 and 1912.